Hello, dear viewers. Welcome to a special roundtable broadcast where we will discuss the public statement by Egon Cholakian, a world-renowned scholar and national security expert, who in his April 13th video appeal revealed what methods and ways are causing the decline of democracy and fundamental values in the world nowadays. We're going to talk about how this directly affects not only each of us sitting at this table, but also all of you who are watching this broadcast right now. I would like to begin today's discussion with a question. What were the most interesting points for us in Egon Cholakian's statement?
The video with Egon Cholakian contains a lot of information. He's basically revealing the cards of how we humans are being manipulated, every single one of us. And if you feel that terrible things are happening in the world, that there are strange and illogical things happening, or you see that people are actually disgruntled and angry at each other, then right now it is the best time to pay attention to these while we still have such an opportunity. Egon Cholakian's team has shown that the overall instability in society is actually the result of the work of an invisible intelligence network. They have identified the methods and tactics this network is using, and they have determined who is behind it. They have also described how this intelligence network is expanding and how mass media are changing our worldview. For me personally, that was actually the most powerful point, which gave me an impetus to carefully follow the threads which Egon Cholakian has slightly unraveled in his video. Because when you see certain moves in one sphere, you can stop seeing them in other spheres as well. And then it becomes absolutely clear that any kind of division among people and any pitting of one group of people against another is in fact a result of the work of that invisible entity, that intelligence network.
Let me add to what you've said regarding the work of this invisible intelligence network. For me, one of the very interesting moments in that video was when Dr. Egon Cholakian asked all of us a question. It was mainly addressed to Americans, but in essence, everyone can answer it. Looking into the camera, he suggested that all of us honestly ask ourselves the question, do we believe that America is in decline? And then he basically said that 30 years ago, if we would ask ordinary Americans the same question, they would have found it absurd. I lived in America, and I remember that even 20 years ago, Americans were very proud of their country. They love their country, and they used to be confident in it. But what's happening nowadays? Today, according to various sociological research in the US, the faith of Americans, especially young ones, in their country is declining. Their faith in democracy is diminishing. Their belief that America is great is diminishing. And young people are unwilling to start families. It is also interesting that sociologists comment that this is very strange and they're sounding the alarm because there is no reason for such attitudes. In reality, people have no reason to feel this way because their economy is still the most powerful in the world. GDP is growing, unemployment is the lowest in the US history, and yet, in the minds of Americans, there are thoughts that America is declining. The most interesting thing is that when I look into my own head, I have exactly the same picture. I think that something is wrong with America. And I cannot explain why. I actually checked it out, and indeed, as Dr. Egon Cholakian said, there is economic stability in the US. So why do we have this feeling that America is declining? Where is it coming from?
I have to admit that I also see these tendencies, this kind of perception that something is wrong, that the system is collapsing and falling apart. I actually hear this from people around, as well as in my own head, that this should allegedly stop, that the system will break down, and so on. I keep asking myself a question, and I address questions to other people. What do you really expect to happen when the system collapses? What will take place? What will happen to you? What will happen to your family? Most often, people don't find specific answers to these questions. Most often, a person changes the topic and doesn't want to discuss it any further, although in fact, he realizes that this kind of mindset is already laying a foundation for what is being prepared, for that very plan that is being formed in public consciousness, in public opinion. And that's exactly what is happening in our country. the Czech Republic. That's what we hear and that's what we perceive. We should also mention that our friends in Slovakia arranged a roundtable too, where they discussed Egon Cholakian's video. They have basically exposed how this manipulation is working in their country. And today, we're going to take a look at how it is done where we live.
Well, yes, they also mentioned that everything begins with a slander. Then there are restrictions on freedom of speech, and later on some legislative restrictions begin. But since everything is caused by the actions of some invisible network, basically an intelligence network, this means that we are only a step away from actually losing our liberties and our democracy. I now mean democracy in the best sense of this word. Not just the one on paper, but the real values which actually enable us to live the life we want.
I would also like to add to what has already been voiced because, let's just say, this puts a crucial fundamental question on the agenda. When those shadow players who are behind this kind of manipulation of people's consciousness are making the biggest mistake that can generally be made by them or anyone else on the planet. After all, the current problem is climate disasters, but unfortunately, at the moment, instead of uniting, instead of bringing scientists to the same table, and instead of realizing that we should fight for our lives, we are all fighting each other. Those forces, those power entities, unfortunately influence everyone's opinion in our world, divert people's attention to an absolutely wrong direction, the direction which won't help anyone, and on the contrary, push us into the abyss that we are now facing. Therefore, now we need to become aware of this entire structure, and so today we are going to figure out how it actually works so that everyone understands what the problem is and what all of us should focus our attention on.
It's important not to let them create obstacles on our way.
All this time, we've been saying that some invisible network or intelligence network globally influences our society, and we can see how they are launching a huge disinformation campaign, specifically in the Czech Republic and Slovakia. When Egon Cholakian referred to this invisible network in his speech, he used a term, the KGB Hydra. Does this mean that it is basically some kind of an intelligence network operating from somewhere in Russia? Or how exactly should we interpret that?
Well, here it is very important to carefully watch the video with Dr. Egon Cholakian because he explains specifically and precisely what it is. He certainly doesn't say that it is KGB as such. He says that it's a hidden entity inside this organization. It is kind of an offshoot that remained unnoticed even by those who worked alongside it. And this is a very crucial point. In other words, this entity operates in a very secret mode. And that's why he called it a Hydra. Yes, he called it a mythological creature that operates absolutely unobserved above everyone so that nobody could see it. And that's a fundamental problem. It is also interesting regarding the time when it was formed and what it has done over the period of its existence. Here it's extremely important to understand that the words Egon Cholakian said in his video appeal are crucial for realizing how this network actually works across the planet, because that's exactly the reason why the Hydra was mentioned. For it really works this way. As a matter of fact, this is similar to a legendary TV series.
The Octopus.
Yes, Italian TV series The Octopus.
Also, it's important to add that it works autonomously. It doesn't work within a separate country and doesn't defend the interests of particular countries. It operates for its own goals. And what is actually its goal? In fact, it is to gain totalitarian control over what is happening in the world.
And I think it's very important to mention here that those are people who, let's say, don't have a home. It's impossible to say where they are from specifically.
This means they do not defend interests of any state.
Exactly.
They are beyond any political or geopolitical arrangements and have no geopolitical interests whatsoever.
That is, they don't act on behalf of any superpower. That's what it
They
means.
act solely in their own mercantile interests, and they have their own clear goal, which the speakers voiced at the round table in Slovakia. They have a clear goal, and they are totally focused on eliminating all the forces that could counteract their organization, which everyone believed to be extinct after the collapse of the Soviet Union.
This means that any freedoms that we have and any principles of the democratic world are basically a counterforce for them.
Yes, exactly.
So their goal is absolute totalitarianism.
Well, they mainly seek revenge. Actually, Dr. Cholakian also mentioned in his video that initially they founded their state, the USSR, and during its existence they functioned almost like a state within a state and basically strived to gain total control. Later on, they wanted to expand their power to the whole world. However, they didn't succeed because the US intelligence intervened and the USSR collapsed, as we all know from history. They actually regard it as a loss of their honor, that they failed to save what they themselves were building so solidly. And in fact, due to this kind of revenge, they are now trying to finish off democracy as such, not only in the USA, but throughout the world. Yet once again, for our viewers to understand, we're not talking about Russia, so don't think in these terms. It is really important to highlight that this organization doesn't wear any uniform and doesn't represent any country. It also goes against its own people within Russia. I'm saying this because we get a huge number of comments, which we are going to voice, where people point this out, but we'll go back to this later.
The important thing is that they have no nationality.
They have no nationality indeed.
I would just add one more thing, because we actually talked about this before, and it's incredibly important. I perceived it in such a way that now public opinion is based on the widespread information and worldview that everything is collapsing, and that it's allegedly good. In reality, this probably works in their favor because the onset of totalitarianism is usually preceded by a collapse of the system, right? And that's exactly what is happening. The only question is, how can we explain this to people? After all, a lot of people have sort of a romantic idea about it, like, wow, the system is collapsing. It's wonderful. It will finally collapse, and we'll all be all right. But in reality, everything is quite the opposite. So yeah, all of this actually benefits their goals.
It does.
I also encounter the following reaction: the system will collapse and the order will finally be restored. But it is necessary to understand what the order actually implies, what it will mean, or what the goal really is. What will it mean for an ordinary human?
Well, regarding the idea that the system will collapse, people apparently do not understand what collapse of the system means. In fact, when the system collapses, the anarchy arises. That's not really good. We need some kind of a structure in which we would be able to exist. So I wouldn't say it's great if the system collapses. We rather need the system to improve so that we find what unites us and what is good in the system and good for the people.
It is also very important to understand their goals or gradual steps they are taking, because both in Slovakia and in Czech Republic, we can clearly see how they are trying to set a precedent at any cost. This applies to the Allatra International Public Movement as well, which has been exposed to 10-year defamation from those who are, let's say, the henchmen of that hidden entity. Moreover, it's extremely important to realize that those organizations, or that organization, if we can call it an organization at all, since it is sort of a hidden structure, well, I don't know. There are a few old fellows who hate the entire world, who hate absolutely everyone. So I think it's important to understand in what hidden way they influence the opinions of all people around us. I think it's extremely important, and today we will try to reveal this information in such a way that everyone would be able to see themselves in this process. Because friends, whether we want it or not, all of us have been drawn into this global game of those inhumans, which has nothing to do with people in fact. It's important for us to understand the cause and the consequence, so that we don't take the side which somebody will assign to us by saying, this one is good and that one is bad. We should be on our own side, on the side of people.
Let me add something regarding this name, the KGB Hydra. You actually already mentioned that it is sitting at the bottom. Nobody sees or notices it, but at the same time, it is extending its tentacles. They are directly connected to people's consciousness, and thus it influences the way we think, what we do, what our mood is, and is basically directly promotes its own goals and interests.
How does it do that?
Well, it actually generates negative mental images which are instilled into people's perception. And through those images, it makes it impossible to resolve any crisis or achieve any mutual agreements. But it also seems important to me that Egon Cholakian has emphasized that this doesn't mean that, for instance, national leaders who are responsible for what is happening in the world are directly connected to this network, to the KGB Hydra. Basically, they are or can be under exactly the same influence as all other people, simply when they accept a negative mental image. And today we will definitely discuss how they spread those images afterwards. But they themselves accept those too. It's just that with national leaders, there's actually a huge risk since they bear enormous responsibility. A situation may arise where, for example, they would internally begin to agree that this is perfectly fine to press the nuclear red button, just following certain convictions. For instance, such a conviction that the public wants that. Meanwhile, this whole image may be generated totally artificially by the KGB Hydra. I mean the image of the prevalent public opinion.
You've said that they directly connect to people's consciousness and they actually create a negative image. But in order to do that, they need some tools. What else could it be except mass media?
Dear viewers, does what Veronica and Karolinka have just described seem unrealistic to you? Honestly, look at the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. I believe 10 years ago none of them could foresee what would happen today, but it is now happening. So perhaps each of us should address this question first of all to ourselves, and with all honesty. We should look into our own heads and look at what we ourselves believe in.
Yes, when something that seemed completely absurd actually becomes reality.
To be honest, it seems absurd to us too. How could a fratricidal war begin? Yet it has started and it keeps going on. It's been going on for such a long time already.
Indeed, Egon Cholakian disclosed a lot of details, and I strongly recommend that you watch this video. He describes what mechanisms are actually used. And the moment when something is being introduced in society is such that a wave of disinformation or manipulation is first launched. There appears some discrediting or untruthful information, false information, and then they wait for somebody to pick up this information. Of course, those will be journalists, as you've already mentioned.
But why journalists? Why do journalists pick this up?
Most importantly, and it's a good question, what type of journalists pick up such false information?
Those who enjoy sensations.
Yes, exactly. Those who enjoy sensations, who are not interested in the truth. They're ready to step over their own conscience, to violate journalist ethics, and to ruin the lives of ordinary people. They don't care if they actually go against normal human values. They don't care about anything of that kind. So they start working with this information. They write an article and then they refer to it themselves. And later on, other journalists can start referring to this article as well.
Those of the same type.
Yes, journalists of the same type and with the same characteristic features. Eventually, there arises a whole network, and we can already call it a network of agents of influence, which directly, consciously or unconsciously works for the KGB Hydra.
Maybe we could explain it using a concrete example. What do you think?
We sure can, of course. There is a really significant example, and all of you should probably understand that, in fact, for 10 years, an organization which is absolutely peaceful and is doing its best to inform people about the impending threat has been defamed. It is ALLATRA, International Public Movement. It is extremely important to realize the key point why those entities have chosen ALLATRA. It's because, well, we're going to talk about this today because they called us all kinds of epithets, starting from sectarians and up to, I don't know, terrorist organizations and so forth. Moreover, without any proof whatsoever, without any official decision.
Criminal organizations.
Exactly.
With absolutely no respect for the presumption of innocence.
Exactly. But it is actually important to understand the reason. Well, the answer is very simple. It is because if they manage to destroy an organization of this type, an organization that really complies with
We comply with all the laws and we speak about the climate, which is the most pressing issue right now. We are in full compliance with the values of democracy. We are absolutely independent. We are independent financially. There is no influential protector or politician behind us. There is absolutely nothing that anyone could possibly pick on in order to denigrate us. And yet it is happening. To a certain degree, they succeeded in that.
Well, they succeed precisely because there is no protector, no patron behind the ALLATRA international public movement. That's why such tricks can work out.
We are vulnerable.
It makes the whole movement extremely vulnerable.
And this is actually quite interesting for them. In fact, if they succeed to move forward with their plans by persecuting the ALLATRA movement, they will cross the line of democracy, so to say, basically cross the boundaries of our freedoms. That's true. After all, we operate in 180 countries, hence they are going to get not only into the democratic countries of Europe, but basically lay their hands on the whole world.
They can actually apply the same principle that they used on us.
Absolutely right, and that's actually the danger of the precedent they want to set, because if they show that it is possible to shut down an organization that works all over the planet and consists of ordinary decent people who want to live better, then they understand that they have an open door absolutely everywhere. Unfortunately, there is a huge number of entities which we are going to talk about today and which are on that chessboard, so to speak. And they are basically the ones who facilitate all these processes, even though unconsciously, since in many cases, if we put it bluntly, unless we admit to ourselves that we ourselves have been influenced by these actions, we cannot see the real truth. We must first admit that all of us have fallen under the influence of this little group. Now it's important for us to stand on our own feet, hold firm, and unite for the sake of one goal. This goal is obvious: we must survive. If we don't survive, if we don't save this planet, this ship, this ark, none of the passengers on this ark will survive, including those fellows. Unfortunately, those scums decided to be the last remaining here when they would think they have won. Don't look for any logic in that. There is no logic. It's a sick mind.
It is only revenge.
Exactly.
It is probably worth mentioning that we are giving the example of the ALLATRA movement because this affects us personally, and we know the entire situation. Whereas Egon Cholakian has excellently revealed the whole mechanism of how it all works and how the influence is exerted. But it's important to understand that the KGB Hydra doesn't care about ALLATRA as such. They're basically only concerned with recruiting more and more agents of influence for themselves at the cost of any organization. In other words,
What they are actually going to make of ALLATRA, what they are planning to do. And this is absolutely obvious from the very fact of setting such a precedent in public opinion, is what they can later do to anyone else.
right.
Exactly. That's basically how totalitarianism begins in reality. It all starts with taking one group of people, banning it in one place, defaming it in another, and then on this basis, legislation is adjusted. When that is done on one group of people, restriction of rights of more and more people begins, and everyone eventually finds themselves in totalitarianism without even knowing how. That's exactly how it's done.
I would respond to that because, again, it's important to understand what is the driving force. It is the fear that is artificially induced in people. Someone may say, well, if a person has written something, for example, why is he supposed to be an agent? However, the world is arranged a little differently. If somebody gives money and a person writes something for that money, he sort of signs a contract. If that person thinks that he's fine, that he only wrote his opinion, but he was paid for it, then of course there are documents regarding that. And then if, let's say, God forbid, a discredited part of humanity, in this case, Allatra, gets liquidated, the next step would be to maintain contact with those people who were involved and to force them to do what their customer wants. Because he would say, "Look, I have documents here indicating that you have destroyed a peaceful organization. If you want, I will forward them to law enforcement agencies and you'll go to jail." Or they would create other ways to press on those people, and those executors will do what they want in the grip of fear, because this hydra is built first and foremost on fear.
Now we're talking about those journalists who simply don't have moral values, who don't have any natural human scruples. But at the same time, there are a huge number of journalists who simply search for the truth and fight for these values to be preserved in our society. We are now voicing all this information for them as well, trying to uncover these mechanisms together with them.
So, I think we can now move on to how the Allatra movement is actually being maligned. But before that, I would just like to take the liberty of reading here some of the comments from TikTok that actually appeared under the Slovak Roundtable, which was a discussion program that also responded to Egon Cholakian's call. So, the first comment, false propaganda by the US. Only a pro-Western chump can believe this. What about it? Do you want to comment on that?
What's next?
I've got more to go. Okay, I don't understand this broadcast. Are you defending capitalism? That's what this broadcast sounds like.
We are defending values, actually democracy. We defend that every person should be able to live in accordance with those rights that are not just on paper, but that are actually realized in our society.
Here is
I might add that sometimes when people actually ask me, because we're really so divided today, we can't really imagine how divided we are. People ask me, and you're pro-American or you're pro-Russian? And my answer is, I'm pro-human. So they stay looking at me like, what is that?
Well, when you think about it, it's just the principle of division, that we need the other person to tell us, you are so pro-American, you are so pro-Russian. So that in itself, that question sort of makes absolutely no sense from a human perspective.
It's no sense.
Let's sit on the moon, let's look at the planet Earth, and let's ask ourselves if we are going to be interested in this.
That's right. And I just want to emphasize that actually these comments that are under that video and under Egon Cholakian's video, they show how divided we are. How somebody artificially divided us and forced us, yes, that's the right word, forced us to take somebody else's side. And who is going to side with the people? I'd be openly interested in that.
Well, that's the Allatra International Public Movement.
That's right.
It has to be said that the Allatra International Public Movement has stood from its very beginning until now and will always stand on the side of the people.
It's important to understand one more thing here. Naturally, there are numerous rumors that are undoubtedly unfounded. Unfortunately, we see people who have chosen to disseminate this information as they are doing. Well, what can we say when other people remain silent? That's a big problem for all of us. You see, the truth itself, if it lacks support from the people, doesn't stand a chance. If people stay silent, it will turn out the same way it did before the World War II. Huge genocide, huge problem. And at this moment, it is important to realize that we have another enemy. Much, much stronger. We are not enemies to each other. There is another enemy. It's the climate Cerberus, because these disasters, my friends,
There is absolutely no question that the increase in climate disasters is exponential. This means that each and every one of us will most likely experience a major climate disaster in the next few years. It's just the way it is. It's pure math. This is not some apocalyptic stuff. That's one of the disinformation terms that they tried to put on us and on the work of the Allatra International Public Movement. No, that is pure math. It's pure forecasting, pure statistics.
You know what still amazes me is that I believe it's an undeniable fact that the climate is changing. Everybody should see that, those who just don't put blinders on themselves. I wonder why, instead of all of us coming together, sitting down at the same table, and discussing all these climate issues, we're still arguing, pointing fingers, slandering, and so on. There is so much talk about the climate, that it's this factor, that it's that factor, that it's a cycle, that it's not a cycle, and so on. Well, when someone...
And who demands a solution?
Yeah, sure. So let's all sit down at the same table together and figure it out, right? Let's work on finding the solution together, and that way we can find the solution because it's very simple. Instead of all of this slanderous talk, let us sit down at the table like normal adults and discuss it. That's all we're asking for. We're openly calling for the establishment of a unified scientific center. That sounds like a fantastic solution to me, bringing all the scientists together, all the countries together, leaving egos aside. No country will be above the other, but they'll all be on the same page, working together to find a solution. That's exactly what they show in all those American movies. So why can't it happen in real life if it can happen there?
Well, the problem is also that we need to start engaging in critical thinking. We've stopped verifying information. We've been urging people for 10 years to fact-check information. Why is that? Because it's crucial for our survival. Because someone can come along, throw out some information, and I don't care, I'm either going to accept the information or I'm not going to accept the information, instead of checking it out.
Well, it became a cliche. Critical thinking is basically an empty phrase. But in this instance, when you already know that a huge amount of this manipulative and false information is actually being given out in a targeted, organized way, and it's done by the KGB Hydra, by the intelligence network, here is when the survival instinct kicks in. Just every time I look at the news, I internally ask myself the question, who is actually telling me this now? And for what purpose?
That's a very important point of critical thinking, because when you think about it, the very basic emotion that's being manipulated in the public space, in the media, is fear. That's what you were talking about, fear. When the information comes in, that's our actual reaction. There is psychological research in that. So if the information comes by the means of television, especially in visual form, and it is imbued with fear, then a person accepts it without any critical analysis of the fact that things could have been different.
You are now leading us to the fact that we are, in fact, waging a war in our heads, an information war, and actually deciding what our future will be like, depending on what image we decide to believe in, what image we decide to follow. If ours, that's the one that naturally every normal person wants, to live peacefully and quietly, or we accept the negative mental images imposed on us.
Here's another very important point to realize that we are actually shifting responsibility. This is, shall we say, the foundation of everything these subhumans have built their game on. Shifting responsibility. I didn't say anything, he said. They did it.
They'll decide.
They caused it. They have decided. They are obliged to do something about it, because there were a lot of comments like that. What can I do about it? That's what scientists are for. And people don't even realize what a difficult situation scientists are in today.
If this person would even ask him, herself, how can I help them to start solving this problem?
Exactly.
Don't I live on this planet? But going back to actually the manipulation that's going on right now and our topic. So why is the KGB Hydra currently trying to eliminate the international activities of the *ALLATRA International Public Movement the way it did in Russia, the way it did by analogy in Ukraine, and as it is already making efforts to do in the Czech Republic and Slovakia? That is already in the democratic countries of Europe. One of the negative words that is being spread in the disinformation campaign, the one charged with the emotion of fear. Which word is that?
Cult.
When someone says the word cult to you, what's your reaction?
Distance.
I don't know a person who would react.
Great, I'm with you.
I'm gonna find out more about this.
I'll look into it right away.
What is the natural reaction of the vast majority of people when someone is labeled as cult? What is the natural reaction?
Well, they will immediately back off.
Just distance.
They'll get fear.
They visualize images of,
Negative.
violence and
Extremely
stuff.
negative.
And the person doesn't investigate the information further, just doesn't go any further. Exactly like on the news. The information comes in, fear, it's true. So in this case, absolutely the same analogy. I don't go further, I don't explore more because of this principle.
Or when some good movement, like the ALLATRA International Public Movement, which is just as we said, standing for people and trying to solve the climate problem, someone calls it a cult, then automatically in their mind the intentions can't be true because they're sectarians. For example, I've observed that kind of thing in myself. When somebody tells me that this organization wants to do something good, but watch out, it's a cult. Well, if it's a cult, I don't want to hear any more about it, do I?
I might add one more thing, as you were saying just now, how the ban in Russia and Ukraine came about. That this is absolutely beautiful proof of how the organization actually works. It's like transnational. It doesn't care what relationship any countries or any states are in. It just works on its own way in each country to achieve the objectives. That is, in Ukraine, they label ALLATRA as pro-Russian, funded by Russian sources, and in Russia, they label ALLATRA as pro-Ukrainian, funded by Ukrainian sources. Well, someone asked, what is the reality?
Dr. Cholakian, who works for US intelligence, is going to speak here. Isn't that strange and interesting? And maybe even a little humorous for some who write those comments. I think they must have been shocked when they watched the video.
I would just like to add here to what you said, Veronica, that it really took my breath away when Egon Cholakian named specific practices and manipulations that appeared in the media. When, for example, it is known that there were huge raids, searches and so on in Ukraine, and there was a casual news report about the fact that during the searches they confiscated a pensioner's savings, a pensioner who actually supported the ALLATRA movement. And they presented it in the media that this was supposedly Kremlin money, that this pensioner had hidden in her home, and it was from the Kremlin. I thought to myself, that's impossible.
I think it shows beautifully the absolute cynicism and the attitude that is absolutely unrestrained. It's important to actually bring up another point here, which is that we are already talking about a concrete form of this smear campaign. But this smear campaign was not launched directly by the KGB Hydra. It is using its tentacles, metaphorically speaking, of course, through which it operates. And these are the so-called anti-cult movements.
Yeah, it actually works through what is called two-step camouflage. It finds an organization, a front organization or a dummy organization that's at the forefront so that it is not visible itself. Just like the Hydra, it hides down and actually uses these anti-cult organizations to do just that. And it might be worth remembering something about anti-cult organizations here, because when I first saw Dr. Cholakian's video, it was a pretty new term to me, and I had to do some research on my own.
I think it's true for all of us. We too were shocked at how much they actually got under our skin, the fact that they have infiltrated into the information space, how much we ourselves are actually manipulated by what they've created in that public opinion.
And finally, how much it affects us in everyday life. I didn't realize that at all. For example, the first anti-cult movements actually started in America because in the 50s and 60s, there was a big demand. People just needed something new. There were a huge number of new religious movements, and in response to these newly emergent religious movements, the so-called anti-cult organizations were created. The first organizations were rather local, and then they started to associate on a national level.
I might just make one more little remark here, actually, in researching that information, so that it's also understandable to the viewer in our area. When you say anti-cult movement for us, for Americans, when you say cult, it doesn't have that negative connotation. It's not filled with that fear as it is here. because they just perceive it as some Buddhist sects and so on. But for them, the word cult has the same meaning because they originated in America, those anti-cult movements, while for us, they are actually anti-sectarian.
Anti-sectarian, or movements for the study of cults and new religions. It's such a nice democratic name they gave it.
Well, how did those first anti-cult movements actually work?
What's interesting is that these anti-cult movements operated in a very extremist way. What was behind that? They were afraid. They considered people who were joining these new religious movements to be psychologically manipulated, that they were some sort of weaker individuals who were just being influenced. The term brainwashing was even coined at that time. It's called brainwashing. Hey, they just believed that these people were simply inferior individuals who were incapable of making independent choices, and that they were joining these new religious movements under the influence of some psychological manipulation. And the first anti-cult movement, FRECO, which started in America, was founded by a Christian fundamentalist, Ted Patrick.
A fundamentalist.
A fundamentalist, yes. So Ted Patrick, what's interesting about him is that he was the first one who came up with the methodology of forcible deprogramming of these people. They believed so much that these individuals were like psychologically weak or manipulated or brainwashed that they literally kidnapped these people from these sects, as they call it, and kept them locked up in a hotel for weeks. They were brainwashing them in their own way, in basically exactly the same way, only with the opposite narrative, and mocking, for example, the leader of the movement, keeping them there by force, and so on and so forth. There was a huge spate of kidnappings, and Ted Patrick was behind that. And interestingly enough, later on in America, he just was sued many times. Actually, he had to pay back some money and so on, and had to somehow make amends to these families who actually suffered. And in fact, what's interesting is that these anti-cult movements, for me, are acting kind of like a modern-day Inquisition. Don't you find it a bit similar?
Well, you actually said that the founder was a Christian fundamentalist.
Yes. And what's even more interesting is that actually in America, there were organizations that started to take sides, to actually advocate for these cults. There was an organization there called ASR, and that's actually an organization that fights for religious freedom. And they've managed to sort of pacify those anti-cult movements a little bit, but they haven't quite managed to do that in Europe and in Russia. And what's actually interesting, the anti-cult movements then started to emerge in parallel all over the world. I think it was in 1993 when the anti-cult movement emerged in Russia, and it was founded by Alexander Dworkin. And then in 1994, the European Association, or as they call it, umbrella organization emerged, i.e. FECRIS cover organization, in which he later became the vice president. And for a long time, from 2009 to 2021, it was Alexander Dworkin who was its president. And we'll come back to him because this is a very interesting figure that Mr.
He was mentioned by our friends in the round table as a controversial, absolutely controversial person who actually imposed the whole view of new religious movements or spiritual movements, including the practice of yoga and so on, and painted them in extremely black and white colors. What is right? What is wrong? What actually happens to a person when they become a participant in such a movement? And it was this person who actually created such an image. In other words, contributed as much as possible to the creation of an image of how we understand the term sect today.
And not just sect. He was the first who created the term totalitarian sect in 1993. And what's interesting, he also, like Ted Patrick, for example, was a Christian fundamentalist, and Alexander Dworkin is an adherent or a member of the Russian Orthodox Church. And basically, for him, anything that is not the Russian Orthodox Church is a totalitarian sect. He has gone so far, of course, that he attacked other religious movements, such as the Jehovah's Witnesses. They actually, because of his very strong persecution and pressure, have been banned in Russia. I think in 2017 it was countrywide. I think their headquarters in Moscow was banned. He also was critical to Scientologists. Then he had a very interesting...
As for Scientologists, for example, they have a very, very negative reputation all over the world.
Well, he's done a lot of work in this regard because he's literally like prosecuting these other religious movements like Falun Gong, for example. Anything that is not the Russian Orthodox Church goes against them. He's very extremely negative about all Eastern religious movements, actually.
Wait, you said Falun Gong.
Falun Gong, yes.
I think this movement is very well known in our country, and it is a movement that is facing genocide in its homeland.
In China.
That's right, genocide, literally. And this is a guy who actually supports fighting those movements. Well, just so we know who we're dealing with.
Basically, we can say that this person is convinced that the only correct faith is his worldview, meaning the Orthodox Church, and he's trying to somehow denigrate anything that is different from it.
Well, actually, he does it in such a way that in regard to those cults, totalitarian sects in general, and other teachings different from the only correct one, he attributes to them various features that should be typical only for them. That is, a strong, charismatic leader and absolute submission to his opinion.
Not only that, if you look at his statements on the internet, he goes to the very extremes. He characterizes leaders or entire organizations extremely negatively. He tells that they sell drugs, that there is a sexual abuse there, and so on. For example, I watched a video where he spoke on television, as I remember, on Moscow TV, about Krishna worshippers. And interestingly, I found a huge amount of evidence on the internet what other experts from other countries, professors of religious studies, philosophy, and so on say about him.
Real experts.
Real experts, unbiased experts who had a chance of meeting him, and almost all of them use the word crazy to describe him, that he is insane. We can even find evidence in the web space that this man, who is the leader of the Russian anti-cult movement, suffers from mental disorders. And not just one of them.
It is also important to note that regarding his psychiatric diagnosis, experts have actually assessed his personality type as totally unsuitable to hold such an important position.
Exactly.
To make decisions about what happens in society, about important things in society.
And just to show the absolute absurdity of this man's behavior, he is not only going against classical new religious movements like the Jehovah's Witnesses or Scientologists and against Krishna worshippers, he is even critical of yoga, which is just absolutely absurd because nowadays every third woman on earth practices yoga. In his opinion, all women who practice yoga are sectarians just because they practice yoga. That's what he says.
I would now remind our viewers that this is such a tricky point. A person tends to think, this doesn't really concern me. But then such things manifest themselves in everyday life. They become quite visible. Actually, it can very quickly come to the point when it will concern absolutely every one of us.
I just wanted to add an interesting piece of information that such a person isn't really supposed to be in the leadership of such an important anti-cult organization. And not only in Russia, but he has been at the head of FACRIS for quite a long time, and he is to this day.
Perhaps we should explain once again what FACRIS actually is.
I already mentioned that it's an umbrella organization of anti-cult movements in Europe. It operates in 40 countries, 5 of which are non-European. While this man was actually its head for a long time, and since 2021 he has remained a permanent member of FACRIS, although FACRIS indicates on their website that he is no longer connected with them, but the Russian anti-cult organization indicates that it is still associated with FACRIS. These are other interesting manipulations that can be traced in the internet space.
This man had an opportunity to directly influence the European environment and thinking.
He did influence.
This very man.
Yes, this man with very severe, clearly provable psychiatric diagnoses on which a great number of experts around the world have commented.
A socially dangerous person.
That he is a socially dangerous person. This is also proven by the fact that he was even seriously charged, in particular by Krishna worshippers, when he tried to accuse them, but the court dismissed the charge. A professor from Canada participated in the trial and said that the whole trial was falsified. You can find this video on the internet. It was all recorded, and Mr. Dworkin physically attacked a representative of Hare Krishna there. The police had to intervene, and despite this incident, the court dismissed charges against him.
Well, if we listen to all of this, then a question actually arises. How can these factories, which you've mentioned, be funded by the French government?
Yes, it's partially funded by the French government. That's right.
That means a huge additional reach and additional influence.
I also wanted to mention a religious movement in Russia, which was called the Church of the Last Testament, or it was also known as the Vissarion movement. Why do I mention it? Because this movement actually lived peacefully. They just bought a piece of land somewhere in Siberian taiga. There was a whole community of people living there, and they lived peacefully like that for 30 years. And then what happened? They started having a certain political influence, and recently, also on the basis of such lobbying work by Mr. Dworkin, this movement was actually disbanded by the Russian authorities. Now hold on when you hear this. People who peacefully lived in that community were attacked by 50 armed vehicles, 10 military buses, and several helicopters. In my opinion, it's just insane to wage this kind of attack on ordinary civilians, on peaceful families who respected the law and simply lived their own life and had their own beliefs. For me, this is simply...
It was actually quite surprising for the intervening party that no one resisted them.
Yes, no one resisted them.
They just came there fully armed.
Against ordinary people, this is an essential example for us. We can really say fully armed. You've put it just right.
Listening to this, I can't get rid of the thought that these anti-cult organizations resemble modern-day inquisitions. They've empowered themselves to tell people where to go and not to go. This is actually terrorism.
Yes, you can go this way and you can't go that way.
Exactly.
All this is what extremism and terrorism is. This is actually the worst thing imaginable in a free society.
That's why the first anti-cult movements in America were condemned as extremist, right? And they were banned there.
Well, they weren't completely banned. They had extreme ways of deprogramming people, and yes, many of them were brought to justice. They had to answer for their actions, but they were not completely banned.
And here's another interesting point, the concept of brainwashing you mentioned. Just at the time when anti-cult movements arose in America, they completely debunked this concept as pseudoscientific, as something that does not actually exist. And what the anti-cult movement is in the form they describe is something that lacks scientific evidence.
So in essence, anti-cult movements de facto, due to the frequent presence of representatives of traditional churches there, especially the Roman Catholic or Russian Orthodox Church, and so on, in a way protect these mainstream traditional religions. But essentially, they attack new religions. They criticize what is actually inherent in these traditional churches. I can only speak for myself because I come from a Christian tradition, and from childhood, helped the clergy in the altar. And now, yes, anti-cult movements condemn new religious movements for having an authoritative leader. But for me, as an 8-year-old child, when I helped in the altar, Our priest was a huge authority. So in a sense, anti-cultists should primarily oppose the largest traditional churches, not the smaller ones.
I'll just tell you one more thing. This information that you are saying, after all, one may trace a double standard here, that in one case it's absolutely something normal, ordinary, that a normal person doesn't think about. Yes, that's how it works. But in the other case, in the case of so-called new religious movements, sects, cults, the same thing is interpreted as something extremely negative, as something to beware of. Beware. You have to watch out for that because it's already manipulation and it's something potentially extremely dangerous for you. So it's actually like the principle of manipulation that is used in public opinion, that we think of one thing as normal even though it's the same thing. We don't think it's a bad thing at all, and we think of the other one exactly the opposite.
Or in this way, the anti-cult movements actually label the new religious movements as millennialists. Sort of, they're expecting the end of the world and so on. But as for me, as a Christian, when we went to church, we normally read Revelation of John and stuff.
Another example, yes.
We had a meeting every Thursday for us altar boys, and I remember as a kid one moment that I just once accepted the idea that if I really don't go to church every Sunday, when the final judgment comes, I would just get burned, that the angels would judge me precisely as described in the Revelation of John. So in the same way, they're criticizing the new religious movements.
Well, but David, that means that you were part of a sect, because the way you talk sounds like you were part of some sect.
Well, I attended the Roman Catholic Church.
Well, I just wanted to add that what we've been describing is happening in America and in Russia. We in the Czech Republic are no exception to that either. We could actually take a good look at how it works in our country as well.
Yes, because when you say the word sect, I think we all understand what a negative connotation it evokes in us. And what caught my attention was that part of the video with Egon Cholakian, where he unveils the whole octopus, all the tentacles of Hydra, or the heads of Hydra, where it directs them and through what they operate. So I was just interested in this notion of the anti-cult movement, and I was searching what I know about them in general. Well, I knew practically nothing before I started researching this information, and I was completely unaware of one important fact. We are being indoctrinated from our school years with a negative opinion towards a sect. Attention, that a sect means manipulation, threat to life, threat to liberty, etc. The anti-cult movements, compared to sect movements, are actually responsible for far more lives ruined and far more victims than all the sects, religious movements, all these movements that the anti-cult movement is railing against. This was an absolutely shocking fact to me, which, to put it simply, dumbfounded me.
Huh.
Because this is so, and we mentioned Falun Gong, and we can go on. We could go on, but right now we are going to focus on how it works here in the Czech Republic. Because when we ask about whether anti-cult movement works in our country, whether we can trace the influence of Mr. Dworkin and who Mr. Dworkin is, I think it has been explained here.
We understood.
The explanation has been quite clear and straightforward. So let's look at the parallels. FECRIS was founded in our country in 1993.
1994.
A Society for the Study of Sects and the New Religious Movements was founded, parallel to that. The spokesperson for this Czech variant of the anti-cult movement is a religious scholar who to this day has been the most quoted so-called expert on new religious movements, trends and particularly sects. And he is also the editor-in-chief of an online media religious info service. His name is Denek Wojtyszek.
Right, and you've mentioned new religious movements and at the same time sects, so maybe it would be good to explain to the audience how they are related or what this is. Basically, nowadays, when we hear some speaker, like the spokesman mentioned earlier, it is often said that the term sect is no longer used because it has sort of pejorative flavor and everyone already imagines a negative association with it. So nowadays they actually use such terms as new religious movements, but basically it's the same as the term sect. We should just emphasize that the pejorative undertone of the word sect was created by those fellows themselves, by active participants of the anti-cult movement.
Wait, just so I understand this correctly, this religionist, Wojciech himself, claims that he doesn't actually use the term sect, am I right? That he avoids the term sect when referring to new religious movements. And do they have, like, a website?
Well, David, if you Google Zdenek Wojtyszek, religionist, one of the first links is to his website. When you open his site, just on the homepage, you have a link that takes you directly to the anti-cult movement, and the site is called secti.cz.
Okay, so he's avoiding the term sect, but his domain is www.secti.cz, right?
Yeah.
Wonderful, perfect. And wait, Mr. Zdenek Wojciech, this is the same Mr. Zdenek Wojciech, who is also the preacher of the Church of the Brethren, right? Just to be clear.
Right, yes, we'll definitely come back to that because it's one of the next parallels that we can find between our anti-cult movement and others that we've already talked about.
Wait, and this anti-cult movement, I was just searching for it. It's called the Society for the Study of Sects and New Religious Movements. And the chairman of this anti-cult movement is a Roman Catholic priest, right? I'm just trying to understand whether it's the same organization.
I think all the members, these people, all belong to the Christian church. It just happens to be so.
It's so typical of the anti-cult that, in essence, these, how shall I put it,
Founders,
or actually members, they at the same time belong to the traditional church.
Because how can, in simple, common sense terms, how can a representative of a religious movement independently evaluate other religious movements if he himself is convinced of the only correct faith? I mean, it's either the faith of the Roman Catholic Church or the faith of the Church of the Brethren. Whatever, right? So basically, it just doesn't make sense.
Studied and have no conflict of interest.
Right.
that's right, because this is precisely the point at which we need to engage critical thinking. You have traditional churches and the so-called new religious movements, and the suppression, studying in quotes, but in fact the suppression of new religious movements, which is carried out by people who consider themselves part of these traditional churches, then a normal thinking person, a healthy thinking person should ask, is there not a conflict of interest here?
I'll also add to that because right after watching Egon Cholakian's video, I also searched for anti-cult. I was looking for what we can find, and I was shocked at how much experts, the unbiased scientific community, warn and caution about the influence of anti-cult movements. And since we are talking about this now, I'd like to say that this is one of the specific points that they put a lot of emphasis on, that, in fact, there is this clash of interests there.
If we return to the concept of a new religious movement and the concept of a sect, these religious scholars, supporters, actually representatives of the anti-cult movement in our Czech Republic, do not use this term themselves. But indirectly, through the media, they say that it is the same thing. We will come to this later, but what do I want to say? That precisely on this internet resource, which is run by the above-mentioned religious scholar Zdenek Wojtyszek, we can see what a stunning campaign is conducted against the ALLATRA International Public Movement. Against this movement, I mean, there are more than 25 slanderous articles about this movement on this religious info service. And the maximum merits in creation of these articles belong to two authors, two religious scholars. Plenty of articles.
Plenty of them.
Quite right. But it must be said that we are talking about Mr. Wojtyszek and his student. And to make it clear, the student himself, Mr. Ludwig, who is also often quoted by the media Unfortunately, in his thesis, although he quotes other religious scholars, he eventually comes to the conclusion that it is enough for him if he proceeds from the theoretical concept of his teacher, Zdeněk Vojtěšek. That is, we have exactly the same similar base of opinions here. And if we summarize what lies at the heart of this idea, these thoughts, he himself emphasizes in his thesis. To summarize it simply, new religious movements are conflictual.
Conflictual. It's a very brief summary that actually speaks volumes. I would perhaps follow up on that right away, as I mentioned those experts who actually cautiously comment on anti-cult movements. So we can cite Mr. Luzhny's religious studies as an example. He is an unbiased religious scholar, and he writes about the fact that the anti-cult movement, I will quote now, talks with bias and agitation about processes that are described neutrally in the literature. It talks of these processes only in the context of tragic excesses. Thus, generalization results in describing ordinary processes as highly dangerous and exceptional phenomena. This is just to draw a parallel to what conflict means in the understanding of the anti-cult
I
movement.
have a question. Why the media don't use, for example, Mr. Luzhny, a religious scholar who really...
That's a good question.
This is a very good question, because we have experience as far as the *ALLATRA International Public Movement is concerned. In one article, in a slanderous article with the purpose to defame, they also appealed to Mr. Luzhny. But as he answered that the *ALLATRA International Public Movement is not a sect, it cannot be called a sect. This movement cannot be called a sect. The editor didn't consult him afterwards.
So, can we sum it up by saying that Mr. Luzhny is not controversial enough for our media?
Rather too scientific, I would say.
Too scientific.
He, unlike Mr. Wojciech, does engage in independent scholarly religious studies.
So, if I have listened to you attentively, it is clear to me now that a new religious movement is equated with a sect.
Well, in its essence, yes, because although the religious scholars led by Mr. Wojciech avoid this term in every possible way, as for other articles in the media, as I said, journalists have nothing against this term. That is, they refer to those initial slanderous articles by Mr. Wojciech and his disciple Ludwig, while they themselves do not study a new religious movement at all, saying simply sect.
Well, firstly, the anti-cult counts on it. They just know that the media have such tendencies. They know that the main thing for the media is a sensation. It's important for them to be read, and in fact, bypassing some moral principles is not an obstacle for them. We've already talked about this in the introductory section. So I think it's pretty clear that these kinds of reviews, you asked the question, why aren't serious religious scholars quoted? Because the media is just not interested.
They are just not sensational or scandalous enough. In fact, it's like...
They're boring. They're boring to them.
Actually, if you think about it, the basis of Mr. Wojciech's idea is that new religious movements and sects are inherently conflictual. That in itself is attractive to the media, isn't it? If I were a journalist, I would prefer to choose someone like that because I would have a better chance of being read.
But, sorry to step in, but if I look at it as a citizen, just an ordinary citizen, then I understand that we live in a world where everything costs money.
Right.
Isn't that so? Which means, if I'm getting this right, the anti-cult organizations create a certain demand, and they are willing to pay for this, because we know that the media doesn't work for free. This means that someone is capable of paying a large sum of money, as Egon Cholakian mentioned in his speech, that $200 million was spent on discrediting *ALLATRA. If you look at how much it costs to publish an article on the front page of any major newspaper, it's around $100,000. So what are we talking about? This means that an anti-cult organization who decides to discredit someone will provide funding for it. So it's crystal clear to me that anyone in this terrorist organization is financially supported by someone who provided the money, and we are back to the Hydra.
To the shadow power.
Whether we like it or not, we are back to where we were. And I think it's important to expose these tentacles here in the Czech Republic. Because what some people have done here, the lies, the dirt they've poured on decent people, they should be held accountable for their actions. In any case, because none of us have taken any actions against the state. On the contrary, we support the state. We support UN resolutions. We support everything. And these people have elected themselves to be leaders. Of whom? The new modern Inquisition. I'll come back to this. Sect equals new religious movement. And we have it other way around. New religious movement equals sect. And who determines what a new religious movement is?
Well, it's quite amusing because if you look at how they try to define it, they themselves acknowledge that the definition is so broad and vague that it's impossible to express it simply and in a way that's universal. Even religious scholars don't have a unanimous opinion on what is it.
Well, I think it's extremely significant and important that, in addition to this, these anti-cult movements are increasingly encroaching on the public sphere, increasingly influencing legislation and legislative processes. Because we know that, for example, Mr. Wojciech, and this is information that can be traced, information available from open sources, directly collaborates with Biska. And he also directly collaborates with the Ministry, right, of Culture, the Ministry of Culture, or
With the police.
with the police. In what way?
There is such an interesting situation because if you look at the website of the Ministry of Internal Affairs, there is an article about sects. And when you read the article, somewhere in the middle of the paragraph, it says that anti-cult movements are generally dangerous because they take on the role of overseers of religious organizations and use scientific language for this purpose. A few paragraphs below, it says that in the Czech Republic, the Society for the Study of Cults and New Religious Movements acts as such an organization representing anti-cult organizations. And a few paragraphs below that, it says that the police of the Czech Republic collaborates with this organization.
No kidding, huh? I would say it's already a complete mockery. Doesn't this indicate that the Hydra is trying to target those agencies which already directly affect society itself and are directly involved in maintaining order in society? Don't we have such a thing in our country?
Well, that's exactly what the unbiased experts point out. They precisely warn. I know I recently read a study by the Institute of Sociology of the Czech Republic Academy of Sciences, and they expressed their horror at such a situation. How is it possible that with all that we already know from religious scholars, from sociologists of religion...
And now you're referring to religious scholars as experts.
Experts, not church preachers like Mr. Wojciech.
What we already know about anti-cult activities, actually the authors of that article expressed dismay. How is it even possible that until now there hasn't been widespread condemnation, necessary condemnation of such anti-cult activity here?
From the academic community and the public, right? Absolutely. Right.
And they are actually appealing to the state. They mention that the anti-cult is infiltrating the state bodies and the state apparatus. And they urge the state to remain only in the role of the guarantor, who will ensure religious freedom.
Is there any organization at all that stands on the side of people for religious freedom in the Czech Republic?
No.
If something like this happens to you, where would you go?
Where would you turn if something like this happens?
I don't know.
That's very interesting. So one thing follows from this. That is, on the official website of of a governmental institution that is one of the ministries, it's written that anti-cult organizations should be stopped.
Well, there is a warning about the dangerous influence of anti-cult organizations.
Great. And a few paragraphs below it says that the police of the Czech Republic collaborates with an anti-cult organization.
And they get information about their members as well.
This is very interesting. It means that if there is, let's say, democracy in the Czech Republic, we recognize it.
Freedom of choice.
Freedom of choice, freedom of speech.
Freedom of religion.
Exactly. So how is it possible that such completely opposite information appears on this website?
Well, it's a mockery. To me, it's a mockery of people.
How can someone call someone like Mr. Wojciech a judicial expert? On what basis?
Actually, in other works by unbiased experts, a warning is given against the fact that the anti-cult movement has appointed itself to the role of the arbiter, when it would be more correct to put the anti-cult movement under scrutiny, because the experts, the academia, see the danger this movement poses to the community as a whole, to society as a whole. Because we have mentioned here several times that this movement is spreading lies and defamatory articles. But let's look at what this means specifically for ordinary people. What does this mean when you attend, let's say, a yoga class, and suddenly your interest becomes something that the Society for the Study of Sects is after? What does that mean for your family? What does it mean for your environment?
I'll give you an example. For instance, with the Sadhguru website. I think it was the spiritual teacher, Mr. Vacek, right?
Yes.
And something similar actually happened with them right here in the Czech Republic. Mr. Vacek wrote a book based on some Eastern concept of the meaning of life, let's say. And he has his own school that people attend. A defamatory article was written about him by Mr. Wojciech, and it got to the point where even the family that worked with him was investigated because they have a daughter, so there wouldn't be any influence from a sect. Meanwhile, the daughter was doing well in school, had her own interests, and was perfectly happy in her family, simply because the parents practiced this teaching. And this is in such a democratic state as the Czech Republic, where you have freedom of speech guaranteed by the Constitution, where you have the right to believe in whatever you want. And thanks to such articles, the family came under investigation, and possibly if other factors hadn't intervened, they might have even taken the child away. And actually, on this website, there is an open letter from another religious scholar, Mr. Szczasny, who personally knows Mr. Vacek, and he also comments on this article and writes that everything written there is just Mr. Wojciech's conjectures, that he didn't actually check the facts, didn't analyze anything, but just wrote some of his personal conjectures, and thus brought problems upon this family and Mr. Vacek.
I think at this moment we need to step back a little and look at what we were talking about at the beginning. Because I feel like the viewer may still feel that it doesn't concern them because they're not practicing yoga, for example. But in reality, what is the goal of the KGB Hydra? We've talked about it, to have a network of influence agents there. But it's not just about suppressing certain movements or certain teachings. With these agents of influence, they are able to elevate any person, and when it's convenient for them, overthrow them again. And this already concerns politicians, which means it affects our everyday lives, because they can influence what we can and cannot do. And as soon as they cross that line in one area, and we allow them to do so by remaining silent, that is, we allow them to cross that line to deprive us of our freedoms, or...
Of course, it is also very significant what this KGB Hydra is striving for. It strives for a cultural collapse in America and in Europe. As Egon Cholakian pointed out, everything is heading towards a civil war. And that's exactly so. Because in fact, if they discredit yogis or any religious groups, Then by doing that, they promote religious intolerance, so that these groups are really starting to hate each other. And on top of that, this is supported by the media, and it's really contributing to the cultural breakdown in Europe. I've read a study precisely about that. I can't remember now. I think it's probably from France, because in France, there's the FECRIS headquarters or something like that. There was a very detailed study of it, and the study was called, straightforwardly, How a Cultural War is Carried Out in Europe. Indeed, it's like a war of cultures because all of a sudden, those groups
They become enemies.
Right.
This satisfies those scums. That's exactly what they're trying to achieve, precisely to cause confusion first in people's heads and then in reality. That's what it all really boils down to.
Here it's also important to take into account that you mentioned the United States and Europe, but we shouldn't forget that this hidden influence is exerted mainly in the former Soviet Union, that is, in the current Russian Federation. That's also their main goal, to destroy it from within, which is the simple system of these anti-cult organizations: divide at all costs and conquer. I think we can see a clear parallel with what is happening in history as well. And I will add to what you said, because from the experience of other organizations here in the Czech Republic, we see how they have been discredited and how we have been discredited here in the Czech Republic and in Slovakia. There is a clear parallel with what is happening in Russia and in Ukraine. Only a fool doesn't see that all of this is interconnected. Here it is important to understand that these self-proclaimed anti-cult organizations have been created for the sole purpose of dividing people at any cost, and this at a time when our lives are at stake. At a time when the climate Cerberus is already raging on our planet. This is a catastrophe. Lots of people are dying. It affects everyone. I mean, only an idiot doesn't see what's going on outside his window. And it's going to affect everyone, especially our wallets, folks. Because if there's no place to grow crops, everything will get more expensive. How are we gonna cope with those tragedies and losses?
Exactly. And on top of that, cultural undermining by this method through attaching labels. After all, who among journalists has ever asked us what our position is on geopolitics, for example? How dare newspapers and other media even quote us as a pro-Russian sect? How many times has your name, my name, and Carolina's name been mentioned in articles about us being a pro-Russian sect? We have never in our lives been asked by any journalist what we think about the president of the Russian Federation, or anything like that. We can just see that they are spreading fake articles supported only by the fact that they quote someone who is publicly regarded as a religious scholar. Yes, he has a relevant education, it's true, but on the other hand, does his work actually correspond to the scientific research of a religious scholar? We can see that it does not.
Those are exactly the principles they use. They write articles like this, those slanderous articles, where they seem to behave professionally, but in fact they are stating their own assumptions, conclusions and assessments. They are actually spreading misconceptions, they are spreading misinformation and destroying people's lives on that basis. Because frankly speaking, who among us hasn't faced contempt, ridicule, or the fact that someone, I don't know, a friend stopped talking to us after reading an article in our media, for example in Seznam? Who among us hasn't faced such things?
Yes, it happens every day. At least it happens in social networks where everyday participants of the ALLATRA International Public Movement are subjected to ridicule, name-calling, sometimes very vulgar, and one of our participants even received death threats. And I personally also have received physical threats through social media. Does this seem normal to you?
No, it basically means that these manipulative techniques promote violence in society absolutely openly.
Right.
Exactly.
Isn't this the very extremism that the anti-cult movements seem to warn against? After all, it is outright extremism. That is exactly the hidden threat.
The hidden threat.
Going back to how we arrived at anti-cult movements, let me say that in America, the first anti-cult movement was condemned for extremism because they were actually doing deprogramming, and it was violent. For example, we know that the religious scholar Zdeněk Vojtěch published a work titled Pastoral Counseling Regarding Sectarianism and Sects, where he basically advises how to explain to members of new religious movements that the only proper faith is the Christian faith. There are actually practices described there. In fact, it's direct quoting. Again, this can be found in the articles that are published on the portal of Jiří Vach. It is described there that they definitely engage in deprogramming people to this day. Only, it is done secretly, but it always works in such a way that
it is not done by violent means, but is concealed
behind sweet democratic words such as counseling.
Exactly. They would just find someone in that group who maybe decides that they no longer share the goals of that group. And basically, that person becomes a puppet for them. They start sending him or her out to mass media, and that person becomes a pawn on the battlefield for them, right?
This is exactly what the representatives of academia, those real experts, charge the anti-cult movements with, that they choose some renegade, selectively choose a renegade who has problems with a certain movement, some personal problems, something he doesn't like, and so on, and he is ready to speak against the movement or against the group in an extremely negative and public form. That's the kind of a person they value, and that's exactly the way it is. I think we all see this analogy. We all know what we are talking about and how a person can fulfill himself publicity in this way. But of course, it has absolutely nothing to do with objectivity and the way things really are.
Absolutely nothing. I don't know how to even call it, so that viewers could compare it to something. It's as if I were a football player and played for the Sparta team. Then I argued with my teammates, got angry, said I was leaving them, and then someone from the Slavia team finds me, and I would immediately start bad-mouthing Sparta, telling how awful everything is there. But how come? I would thus be speaking with such hatred and desire for revenge, just to somehow discredit my former teammates with whom I had quarreled.
It's interesting that the example with Slavia doesn't provoke outrage in anyone, but when someone is labeled a sectarian, it becomes a problem because it's a sect.
I'd also like to add that Mr. Ludwig, who is a student of Mr. Wojciech, is actually one of the two religious scholars who are widely quoted and interviewed, commenting on new religious movements, and who are very fond of talking about the Alatra International Public Movement. They express their assumptions, judgments, assessments, and so forth. So it's quite interesting that this man received a not very good grade for his bachelor's thesis. He was criticized for not being able to properly work with facts and for presenting mostly his own assumptions. To be honest, when I was reviewing Mr. Ludwig's thesis, there were a huge number of such points. Even for a person who isn't familiar with this field, it is totally obvious that Mr. Ludwig presents not real facts, but his own conclusions, impressions and assessments. And they are not based on anything that could really be relied on.
It reminds me of something. Do you remember Mr. Dworkin's article about the Vissarionists that we read?
That's exactly it.
Isn't this a clear parallel?
It sure is.
Could you tell us more? I think it will be interesting.
Well, there is an article which Mr. Ludwig directly quotes in his article on the Religious Information Service. And here we definitely see a connection, although it seems to be neutral, in the sense that he simply refers to Mr. Dworkin's article. But we've already discussed who that person is, what kind of a psychopath he is, who ruins people's lives with his speeches. So Mr. Ludwig refers to Mr. Dworkin's article, while in that article Dworkin talks about the Vissarion movement, how incredibly dangerous they are and what terrible things they do based on eyewitness testimonies.
Not a single quote.
There's not a single quote in that article, though. There's nothing to rely on. It's like I would just take a story, someone would tell me something, I would edit something, write it down, and it would have exactly the same value.
When I was reading it, it reminded me of the Yellow Press.
Exactly.
Not a scientific work at all.
That's right.
I'll tell you how I perceived it. I consider it to be worthy of Yellow Press only, and its value is quite appropriate for that.
But that doesn't apply to this one man only. As a matter of fact, unbiased experts most often accuse anti-cult movements of the fact that they don't study materials, but rather purposefully pick and choose only what suits them, manipulating a text, using a subtext and a mosaic composition. In other words, they simply play with the text to convey the information in the manner they want.
There's just that goal, that original intention with which it is created.
I have a question. If there are experts who have generally uncovered this hidden threat, how come nobody responds to it, and how come law enforcement agencies do not react? How can this be happening that those people write crap about anyone they want with impunity? For what purpose? And here we go back to that very Hydra again. Because we really see resistance. We see a scientific community, people who've been dealing with this all their lives, not those who decided to defame others, but those who study things on a scientific basis, from a side. And suddenly you see that, let's say, the overall picture is clear, but nobody is doing anything. Thus, we can see that we are inside that Hydra, and its tentacles are everywhere. Otherwise, how could such things be possible? I'll repeat again, how is it possible to deny the anti-cult on the one hand and cooperate with it on the other?
Moreover, to support it quite broadly, if we take a look, we will see another beautiful parallel, beautiful in quotes of course, between how Dworkin's anti-cult movement operates and how it works here, in our country. There is recruitment of fanatics. In our country, just like in Russia, there is a little man, so to say, who decided to speak out against sects, religious movements, and so on, and to spread information about them. His name is Jakub Jal, and he speaks quite publicly. Interestingly enough, when this man was studying religions at the university, he directly cooperated and probably still cooperates with Mr. Wojtyszek. He is also the one who founded a Church of Satan,
A satanic community.
And before that, paradoxically, he had a community of Christ. It's very interesting how he switches.
He's a quick turncoat.
By the way, what really caught my attention was that Mr. Wojtyszek published an article on the Religious Info Service about a satanic community, and unlike the articles he wrote about the Allatra International Public Movement, that particular article is kind of neutral.
It is so soft. I've read it. It's like nothing special is happening.
No assumptions, no conclusions or inference that it might be a dangerous sect too.
His conclusion even sounds quite positive, that they actually want to help the world. They even get in touch with some organizations that can help them and so forth. That shocked me completely.
Right, and in fact, this guy posts pell-mell on social media without figuring things out, just as it comes into his head. He draws some of his own conclusions from that and doesn't hesitate to violate the law. He's not embarrassed to break the law, although he studied religions. They even invite him to interviews. And we see exactly the same thing in Russia. There is a person who is actually very far from religious studies as a scientific field.
It's interesting how interconnected the anti-cult movement in various countries is. In fact, the connection is practically direct. We've mentioned Dworkin several times today, while his teacher was Johannes Aagaard, who founded the anti-cult movement in Denmark. Now, if we look at the pages of Dingir magazine, where Wojtyszek is the editor-in-chief, he specifically emphasizes the approach of Aagaard in Denmark, from where the Dingir star is shining. In other words, Aagaard was a source of inspiration for Wojtyszek. Besides, there are works indicating that anti-cult organizations basically function as an institutionalized network that has a professional approach. Yet, what is behind these words?
I'd like to add something too. You've mentioned Jakub Jal. I have my own personal experience of direct communication with Jakub Jal. since he actually wrote completely disgusting things in his personal messages to my girlfriend, that she should publicly confess to some sexual practices. It's just the utmost perversion.
And such behavior is illegal,
It
isn't
definitely is, because the woman is being really attacked. And the worst thing is that he later started writing such statements publicly. I would also say that we know that this man, Jakob Jol, is a student of religious studies faculty, and he somehow cooperates with Mr. Vojitis.
He's a public speaker.
He's a public speaker. And he says, for example, let me quote him, "By its symptoms, sectarianism resembles drug addiction. In my view, Jakob understands this field because he himself advocates for marijuana. Moreover, he was a member of a satanic community which he founded back then. One of the things they promoted was legalization of marijuana. But now I want to voice the main point. There's an expert conclusion regarding Jakob Jol, a psychiatric conclusion which states Jakob Jol tends to distort facts and is an unreliable witness. In other words, there's a psychiatric conclusion regarding this individual, that he's an unreliable witness. Yet, he speaks out about various religious groups and presents himself as a religious expert who supposedly understands how everything works there, and thus tries to discredit them."
He is even invited for interviews.
That's right, there are journalists who invite him for interviews.
I see a parallel here with Mr. Dworkin. Don't be angry with me, but he actually has a very strange past too. It seems like they're looking for people with a dark past. Don't you think so?
Absolutely right. The Hydra operates in the same way. It seeks out weak people who, let's put it
That's
this way,
right, the hydra of
Are
fanaticism.
prone to some.
exactly, they are prone to outbursts of aggression.
This definitely applies to Jakob Jol, because he is known for committing various offenses. Once he burnt a Jewish flag in a city square, propagated anti-Semitism, and even vandalized a monument. Such are his inclinations. And then this man labels decent people who discuss issues that are serious for our society as sectarians. Well, it's just
But that's not the end of the story.
unbelievable.
Jakob Jol is also collaborating with Mrs. Kristina Tsirokova, whom our friends have already talked a lot about when they organized their roundtable in Slovakia. They explained that she's an editor who suddenly changed the focus of her report from what she had been previously involved in. She used to cover politics, but then suddenly shifted her focus to sects. Even Slovak state television invites her for interviews now.
As an expert?
As an expert on sects and cults, to speak about the Allatra international public movement.
Which she knows nothing about.
This is something Egon Cholakian speaks about quite extensively in his video. Such an unexpected change of topic in journalism is one of the typical signs that it's actually happening either subconsciously or unconsciously under the influence of some third parties.
I'd like to add one more thing, that in collaboration with Jal, who boasts about it on social media, this editor releases distinguishing material where she directly attacks participants of the Allatra international public movement. She absolutely disregards the presumption of innocence and the right to privacy, basically the main human rights. And in fact, I fully see the parallel, the rhetoric Jal is promoting. So in reality, this quasi-scholar, or he cannot even be called a quasi-religious scholar, he is simply a fanatic who spreads nonsense on the internet. And the fact that he actually collaborates with that editor, while she, in turn, is already invited to public television. Well, this whole story, I just can't wrap my head around it.
It's paradoxical that if we draw a parallel with Russia, Ukraine, and what happened in Slovakia when public television aired a false report, very shortly afterwards, all of these threads lead to a point that they will try to release something similar here. And I cannot help but ask a simple question. Who benefits from this? It's a demonization of people who are trying at all costs to inform others about the threat that is impending for all of us. And again, if there are people who support evil, and that's actually nothing but evil, then we suddenly understand that these are the two entities which fall under the power of that hydra. As the hydra is the head, as Dr. Cholakian said, we know where the head is, yet it has two subdivisions, so to speak, through which it implements what it wants. Promoting religious movements, the main ones,
Anti-cult movements.
and anti-cult movements. Therefore, there is only one conclusion I come to. What we've heard today clearly speaks to the fact that anti-cult movements are terrorist organizations entirely focused on suppressing in any way the effort of honest people to bring changes that are necessary at this time. Because if we do not unite, no one will survive. The paradox is that those sick individuals do not even realize that they are in the same boat together with us. And that's the biggest stumbling block. But the main problem is what? Is that people are silent.
Yes.
Exactly.
This is the biggest problem we are experiencing today. People allow those sick individuals to intimidate them, while those fellows are indeed unhealthy. Either they are sick or they are so embittered, so angry, and so hateful of other people that they are willing to do anything for their aims, which is very sad because it's a result of the destructive consumer society that we have built together.
Yet, how can we counteract their activity? We can really see this process, that we ourselves are actually influenced by anti-cult movements. We ourselves understand that in what way we have always understood the term sects. We never realized who actually instilled this information into our heads and how we perceive it. Very few people know that anti-cult movements represent a real threat to society. So what can we do with this information? What are we? What are we actually today? What are we talking about here?
I believe it is crucial and important for people, for the public to start defending human rights and all the principles of a free society. People should start speaking out. And in fact, Egon Cholakian voiced this point. He even suggested in his public appeal that Alatra should become a symbol of democracy and freedom. Because indeed, as an international movement, we operate based on such principles in 180 countries across the globe, based on the principles of cooperation, the principles of humaneness, and so on. It's all about people getting off their butts, speaking out, and stop dividing themselves all the time according to what journalists foist on them.
Well, those scums, as you say, the Hydra, they actually put spokes in our wheels on the way to solving our crisis. They are really preventing us from solving the climate change problem. They are simply standing in the way, but since it affects all of us, we should ask ourselves, what am I willing to do for the sake of life? And in general, am I willing to openly face the situation, which we have just discussed, with a critical eye, to see what's going on and just begin to uncover those things where we see that we're being forced to step over our conscience, where we're being forced to merely watch how other people are suppressed while we're not helping them.
The international public movement is actually a wonderful example of how it is treated in the public space and how all this is happening. It has been banned in Russia, it is being banned in Ukraine, and what is now happening in our country? Indeed, it's a striking example or a precedent of how to destroy democracy in our country. But if we go back to the essence of the issue, where is the battlefield?
In our
heads.
heads.
That's exactly where public opinion is formed.
Right. Really, if we look back in history, any war doesn't start with a missile attack. It starts with people thinking that way. Even if we consider totalitarianism, as a matter of fact, in order to live in a free society, we must behave like free people. If we don't want to live in a totalitarian society, we mustn't behave in a totalitarian way. And to behave in a totalitarian way means to condemn certain groups of people and tell them that they don't deserve the same rights, or that they should simply be eliminated. Yet, that's what is really happening nowadays. Indeed, in Ukraine, the persecution has been enormous. Egon Cholakian even described how much money is needed to start looting people's houses all over the country, all of a sudden and at once. They began to confiscate people's mobile phones and computers just like that, without any grounds. Although, at that moment, there wasn't any court decision or even mere confirmation that it is some kind of a criminal organization.
It hasn't been judicially substantiated to this day.
To this
But
day.
if we look at it, doesn't it remind you of anything? I mean, that's exactly what happened before World War II. Look at what they made of a nation that gave humankind such talents as Goethe. Look at what they turned this nation into. Who and what methods used for that? After all, those methods are exactly the same as the methods used by the anti-cult organizations nowadays.
Exactly.
Is there any difference? Look at how within a very short period of time they managed to force nearly the entire Europe to regard Jews in a certain way, for instance.
That's right.
What happened next?
What did it lead to?
What did it lead
But
to?
we already see today that the anti-cult movement is behind the genocide of people, for example, Falun Gong.
And that's how genocide actually begins. Let's say if somebody warned in 1919 or 1933 that in a few years such a mass genocide would take place in Europe, everyone would have said that the one who warns is crazy. How can such a thing happen at all?
People wouldn't believe it.
If people said anything about Auschwitz and those things which were going to happen there, most of society would just say, "Oh, please, that's impossible."
The paradox is that humanity had been warned. There were people who spoke about what was coming. They could see further and saw which way everything was moving along. So what? Here we go again. I cannot forget Sophie Scholl, a heroic fighter against Nazi Germany, who was killed by Gestapo at the age of 22. She said a legendary phrase: "The problem is that the majority is silent. They just want to survive and will do what they are told." This is exactly the problem of all of us. We know this problem, it's in our heads. If we do not start talking about it, we will never be able to defeat it, and this problem will devour us. Ironically enough, at the time when we are in danger of total destruction of the planet, people's attention is focused in a specific direction. Self-appointed anti-cult organizations around the world start urging people to hate each other even more. This is what Gabika said here as well, that 20 years ago, if you asked an American, they would tell you that America is paramount. But ask Americans now. This is what we've come to.
And not just Americans. Similar things are happening everywhere. It's going on here too. I see it every day. I talk to people and everyone says, "May the end already come." I ask them, "The end of what? Do you understand that it's all in our heads, this stop sign?" And I think it's all the rhetoric of the Hydra.
It is.
They just found a way, and Egon Cholakian describes it quite vividly. For those who don't believe, he actually tells about those psychophysiological and other laboratories that the former USSR used to have. And those who don't know about it can look into history. This is indeed true. There were brilliant capacities and amazing scientists behind it, so that Hydra actually used those manipulation techniques. And those are not new techniques, they're ancient. It's just that those fellows knew about them, reproduced them, and they're using them on a daily basis. As you said in the beginning, a big-time chess game is now being played.
We go back to critical thinking again. Critical thinking is the most powerful and solid shield that we all need to raise now, metaphorically speaking, because it is precisely critical thinking that enables us to understand why a certain information is presented to us. We should think about its purpose. In the end, if I don't know the answer to the question of what I'm supposed to do when the system collapses, I realize that it's exactly the kind of thinking that needs to be stopped completely. Otherwise, the outcome will be what we saw during World War II.
That's right. I also remember the words of Dr. Echak Adidas, who was a speaker at...
Adidas.
I apologize. Thank you for the correction. He spoke at one of the Creative Society forums, and he said a very good thing which I memorized, that the Third Reich was actually a warning to us. So if we don't want the whole world to be captured by that which turned into the Third Reich. We ourselves, people, mustn't be silent and must stop playing the chess game with those scums, as you called it, Gabby. This is actually the entire point. We should stop dividing ourselves into pro-Russian and pro-American. Damn it! We're all in the same boat, that's the point.
Let me just add, because you said one absolutely key thing from my point of view: goal. We need to have a common goal at this stage. I'll repeat again, we've been saying this for 10 years and we'll keep saying it as long as we can, that we have only one enemy. It is the climate Cerberus, cataclysms that are unfortunately increasing exponentially. Friends, if we don't unite now, we won't have a second chance. Such a shit is going on here. There are truly terrorist organizations, anti-cult organizations. And look, who created them and when did they create them? We have only voiced some information briefly, and you can go ahead and check it out and verify it. We are saying again, don't believe us, but check it out yourselves. That's the critical thinking we were talking about, is a foundation on which we should rely. When you start doing that, you will also realize that we've been talking about climate for so long because we understand the seriousness of the threat, and that we have just one goal: to live in peace and friendship. We should finally start building something and not just keep destroying all the time. Instead of inventing new technologies to make our lives easier, they invent more crazy weapons of mass destruction. Why? Because we are all silent. Just as people were silent before World War II, in the same way we are silent now. I believe everyone is educated enough to understand what's going on. We don't have time. Unfortunately, even time is against us now. If we don't start verifying information, if we don't start thinking critically, and if we don't take responsibility for our own lives, it would mean that we've decided to give up and support those terrorist anti-cult organizations. Well, this actually means that we won't have anyone to blame for. At the end, that will inevitably come. Everything is in our own hands.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.